Welcome, dear listeners, to the sun-drenched streets of medieval Carcassonne. In this chapter, we meet Lady Isabelle de Montefort, a woman of intellect and spirit, trapped in a world of duty and expectation. As we step into her gilded cage, remember, some birds are too beautiful to be caged. Chapter 1. Lady Isabelle's Gilded Cage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Carcassonne, its golden light barely reaching the narrow alleyways between tightly packed stone houses. Lady Isabelle de Montefort stood at her chamber window, fingers tracing the intricate lead patterns of the stained glass. Her gaze wandered over the familiar vista of red-tiled roofs and imposing towers, a view she had known since childhood. With a sigh, she turned from the window and approached her writing desk. Quill in hand, she opened her journal, its pages filled with neat rows of Latin and Greek. Her latest translation of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics lay half-finished, the margins peppered with her own insightful notes. A sharp rap at the door interrupted her thoughts.
"My lady,"
came the muffled voice of her maid, Marie.
"your father requests your presence in the great hall."
Isabelle's quill paused mid-stroke.
"Thank you, Marie. I'll be down shortly."
She carefully stoppered her inkwell and rose, smoothing the folds of her deep blue gown. As she made her way through the winding corridors of the family's keep, tapestries depicting great battles and holy scenes adorned the walls. Isabelle's steps, usually brisk and purposeful, slowed as she neared the great hall. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing a cavernous space dominated by a long table. At its head sat Lord Henri de Montfort, his greying beard neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp as he looked up from a pile of documents.
"Ah, Isabelle,"
he said, gesturing for her to approach.
"Come, we have matters to discuss."
She took her seat to his right, noting the presence of Père Thomas, the family's confessor, and Master Renaud, her father's steward.
"We've received word from Baron Etienne de Sauveterre."
Lord Henry began, his tone measured.
"He'll be arriving within the fortnight to finalize the arrangements for your betrothal."
Isabelle's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the arms of her chair.
"So soon?"
she asked, her voice steady despite the sudden quickening of her pulse.
"Indeed."
Her father replied, a note of satisfaction in his voice.
"This union will bring great prosperity to both our houses. The Baron's lands in Normandy will complement our holdings here in Languedoc beautifully."
As Lord Henry continued to expound on the political and economic advantages of the match, Isabelle's gaze drifted to the great hall's windows. Outside, she could see the bustling courtyard, filled with the sounds of daily life. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of servants, the laughter of children playing.
And of course, we'll need to begin preparations for the wedding immediately."
Her father's voice cut through her reverie.
"Isabelle, are you listening, child?"
She turned back, meeting his stern gaze.
"Of course, Father. I was merely considering the magnitude of this union."
Lord Henry's expression softened slightly.
"I know this may seem sudden, but it is a great opportunity. Baron Etienne is a man of considerable influence. You'll want for nothing as his wife."
Isabelle nodded, her face a careful mask of dutiful acceptance.
"As you say, Father. If you'll excuse me, I should begin my preparations."
As she rose and made her way back to her chambers, Isabelle's steps were measured and graceful. Only when the door closed behind her did she allow her shoulders to slump. She moved to her desk, fingers brushing the spines of her beloved books, Plato, Cicero, Boethius, each one a window to a world beyond the stone walls of Carcassonne. Her gaze fell on an unfinished piece of embroidery, its delicate stitches depicting a scene from Ovid's Metamorphoses. In that moment, the needle and thread felt as heavy as chains. Isabelle sank into her chair, her eyes drawn once more to the window and the world beyond. The sun had climbed higher now, bathing the city in warm light. From somewhere in the distance came the faint strains of a troubadour's lute. She closed her eyes, allowing the music to wash over her. For a brief moment, she imagined herself not as Lady Isabelle de Montefort, soon to be Baroness de Sauveterre, but simply as Isabelle, free to pursue knowledge, to debate great ideas, to choose her own path. The music faded, and with it, the dream. Isabelle opened her eyes, took a deep breath, and reached for her quill. There was work to be done, preparations to be made. And yet, as she dipped the nib into the inkwell, she couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was slipping through her fingers, like sand in an hourglass. The day stretched before her, filled with familiar duties and looming expectations. But beneath it all, a quiet voice whispered of possibilities, yet unexplored, of a life not bound by stone walls and arranged marriages. It was a voice Isabelle had long tried to ignore, but now, with her future drawing ever nearer, it grew harder to silence. She bent over her writing, quill scratching across parchment, as the sun continued its inexorable journey across the sky. Chapter 2. The Knight's Return. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, as Raoul de Valbonne crested the final hill overlooking Carcassonne. He reined in his warhorse, a battle-scarred destrier named Tonnerre, and gazed upon the city he had left behind 5 long years ago. The familiar silhouette of towers and battlements stirred something within him, a mixture of relief, nostalgia, and an unexpected trepidation. Raoul's hand absently traced the outline of the wooden cross hanging beneath his tunic, a habit formed during countless nights in foreign lands.
"Home at last, old friend,"
he murmured to Tonnerre, who snorted in response. As they approached the city gates, the bustle of travellers and merchants grew louder. Raoul's keen eyes, sharpened by years of warfare, took in every detail. Farmers bringing in the day's harvest, pilgrims seeking shelter for the night, guards eyeing newcomers with suspicion. It was a tapestry of life so different from the harsh realities of the Holy Land. The guards at the gate straightened as Raoul approached, their eyes widening at the sight of his weather-beaten surcoat bearing the de Valbonne arms, a silver falcon on a field of blue.
"Sir Raoul?
One of them called out, disbelief colouring his voice.
Is it truly you?"
Raoul pushed back his hood, revealing a face weathered by sun and battle, his once boyish features now chiselled and scarred. A thin white line ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a Saracen blade.
"Aye, Guillaume.
Raoul replied, a small smile tugging at his lips.
It seems the rumours of my demise were greatly exaggerated."
The guard's face split into a grin.
"Welcome home, sir. Your father will be overjoyed. He's been lighting candles for your safe return every week since you left."
Raoul's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of emotion passing across his face.
"Then I'd best not keep him waiting any longer."
As he rode through the familiar streets, Raoul found himself searching the faces of passers-by, looking for those he had left behind. Some he recognized, now older and careworn. Others were strangers, children who had grown into adults during his absence. The sounds and smells of the city washed over him, the calls of street vendors, the aroma of freshly baked bread, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Each sensation brought with it a flood of memories, both sweet and bitter. Raoul's path took him past the great cathedral, its spires reaching towards the heavens. He pulled Tonnerre to a halt, his gaze drawn to the intricate rose window above the main entrance. How many times had he stood before those doors as a boy, dreaming of glory and adventure? Now, with the weight of experience heavy on his shoulders, Raoul found himself wondering what those dreams had cost him. The horrors he had witnessed, the lives he had taken and saved, they had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. As if sensing his rider's turmoil, Tonnerre shifted restlessly. Raoul patted the horse's neck, forcing himself back to the present.
"You're right, old boy. No use dwelling on the past."
They continued on, winding their way through narrow streets until they reached the de Valbonne manor. The sight of the familiar stone walls and iron-studded gates sent a jolt through Raoul's chest. This was what he had fought for, what had kept him going through the darkest nights. The promise of home. Dismounting, Raoul handed Tonnerre's reins to a wide-eyed stable boy.
Take good care of him.
He said, his voice gruff with emotion.
He's carried me through hell and back.
As Raoul approached the manor's entrance, the heavy oak door swung open. Framed in the doorway stood an older man, his once dark hair now streaked with grey, his face lined with years of worry.
Father.
Raoul breathed, suddenly feeling like a boy again. Lord Gaspard de Valbonne stared at his son for a long moment, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and enveloped Raoul in a fierce embrace.
My boy,
Gaspard whispered, his voice choked with emotion.
my brave, foolish boy, you've come home to us at last.
Raoul returned the embrace, allowing himself, for the first time in years, to feel truly safe. Yet, even as he savoured the moment, a restlessness stirred within him. He had returned to Carcassonne. Yes, but to what purpose? The idealistic youth who had ridden off to the Crusades was gone, replaced by a man who had seen the best and worst of humanity. Raoul knew he could never go back to the life he had left behind. But what lay ahead? As his father ushered him inside, talking excitedly of a feast to celebrate his return, Raoul's thoughts turned to the future. He had fulfilled his vow to return home. But now what? What place was there in this peaceful city for a battle-hardened knight? For now, though, Raoul allowed himself to be swept up in the joy of homecoming, pushing aside his doubts and fears for another day. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight was for reunion, for healing, for rediscovering the pieces of himself he had left behind in this city of stone and memory. Chapter 3. An Unexpected Encounter. The morning sun had barely peeked over Carcassonne's walls when Lady Isabelle slipped out of the de Montefort manor, a woven basket tucked under her arm. She had persuaded Marie, her maid, to cover for her absence, spinning a tale of deep prayer and contemplation at the cathedral. In truth, Isabelle craved a moment of freedom before the whirlwind of wedding preparations consumed her days. Disguised in a simple linen dress and cloak, her hair hidden beneath a modest cap, she made her way towards the lower town's marketplace. Meanwhile, across the city, Raoul de Valbonne was embarking on a mission of his own. After a week of restless pacing and stilted conversations with his father, he had decided to seek purpose in the only way he knew how, through service. With this in mind, he set out for the de Montefort estate, hoping to offer his sword in their service. Isabelle wandered between the stalls, inhaling the mingled scents of fresh bread, ripe cheese and fragrant herbs. She paused at a bookseller's cart, her fingers trailing over the spines of leather-bound volumes.
Interested in the classics, mademoiselle?
The bookseller asked, eyeing her simple attire with a hint of suspicion. Before Isabelle could respond, a commotion erupted nearby. A group of young boys darted through the crowd, tossing a small, yelping bundle between them. It took Isabelle a moment to realize the bundle was alive, a terrified kitten.
Stop that at once!
She cried, abandoning all pretense of being a common maid. Her voice rang out with the authority of her noble upbringing. The boys, startled by her tone, fumbled their catch. The kitten sailed through the air, letting out a piteous mew. In that instant, Raoul appeared as if summoned by some higher power. With the reflexes honed by years of combat, he lunged forward, arms outstretched. He caught the kitten mere inches from the ground, tucking into a roll to absorb the impact. As he came to his feet, dishevelled and dusted with dirt, Raoul found himself face to face with Isabelle. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the bustling marketplace faded away. Isabelle's heart skipped a beat as she took in the sight before her, a rugged, handsome man cradling a tiny kitten against his broad chest. A thin white scar traced his jawline, contrasting with the gentleness in his eyes. Raoul, for his part, was struck by the fire in the young woman's gaze. Despite her simple attire, she radiated an air of quiet strength and intelligence that stirred something long dormant within him. The kitten, apparently unimpressed by this moment of connection, chose that instant to sink its tiny claws into Raoul's hand. He yelped, nearly dropping the small creature.
Oh!
Isabelle exclaimed, reaching out instinctively.
Here, allow me.
Their fingers brushed as she took the kitten, sending a jolt of awareness through both of them. Isabelle cradled the trembling animal, cooing softly to calm it.
My thanks, mademoiselle.
Raoul said, a crooked smile tugging at his lips.
It seems I'm more adept at catching crossbow bolts than kittens.
Isabelle's eyes widened.
You've caught crossbow bolts, sir?
Only on Tuesdays.
He quipped, then immediately felt foolish. 5 years at war, and here he was, making jests like a green squire. To his surprise and relief, Isabelle laughed. A warm, genuine sound that lit up her entire face.
Well then, I shall be sure to schedule any kitten-related emergencies for Wednesdays.
Raoul chuckled, feeling more at ease than he had since his return.
I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Raoul de Valbonne.
Isabelle hesitated for a moment, torn between honesty and the freedom her disguise afforded her.
I'm Belle?
She said, opting for a partial truth.
A fitting name.
Raoul replied, his eyes twinkling.
Though I suspect there's more to you than meets the eye, Belle.
Before Isabelle could respond, the kitten squirmed in her arms, reminding her of its presence.
Oh, we should find this little one a home.
Raoul nodded, falling into step beside her as they made their way through the market.
So, do you often rescue helpless creatures in your spare time?
Only on Wednesdays.
Isabelle shot back with a grin. They found an elderly herbalist willing to take in the kitten, and as they said their goodbyes to the tiny creature, both felt a twinge of regret that their time together was coming to an end. As they walked, the bustle of the market enveloped them. Raoul's eyes darted from stall to stall, taking in the vibrant tapestry of Carcassonne life he'd been missing for so long.
I'd almost forgotten how lively this place could be.
He mused, his voice a mix of wonder and melancholy. Isabelle glanced at him, noting the faraway look in his eyes.
And how does it compare to the markets of the Holy Land?
Raoul's eyebrows shot up.
You're well informed for a...
He hesitated, clearly unsure how to address her.
For a maid?
Isabelle finished, a mischievous glint in her eye. He had the grace to look sheepish.
Forgive me, I shouldn't assume.
Perhaps you shouldn't.
She agreed, then softened her tone.
But I'd still like to hear about your travels, if you're willing to share.
Raoul's tension eased at her gentle prodding.
Well, the spice markets of Jerusalem are a riot of colour and scent. Saffron, cinnamon, cardamom, smells I'd never encountered before.
It sounds intoxicating.
Isabelle sighed, her eyes bright with curiosity.
It was...
Raoul nodded, then added with a wry smile,
Though I must admit, after years away, there's something comforting about the familiar smell of fresh bread and overripe cheese.
As if on cue, they passed a baker's stall, the aroma of warm, crusty loaves enveloping them. Isabelle's stomach growled audibly, causing her cheeks to flush pink. Raoul chuckled, the sound warm and genuine.
It seems the lady is in need of sustenance. Shall we?
He gestured towards the stall.
Oh, I couldn't possibly...
Isabelle started to protest, but Raoul was already fishing out a few coins.
Please allow me.
He insisted, passing her a steaming roll.
Consider it thanks for your guidance, and for saving me from the fearsome kitten.
Isabelle accepted the bread with a laugh.
My hero.
She teased, taking a bite.
Still warm.
They continued their stroll, the simple act of sharing bread, creating an easy intimacy between them.
So, Sir Raoul,
Isabelle ventured.
What brings a world-traveled knight back to our humble Carcassonne? Surely Jerusalem held more excitement than our sleepy city.
Raoul's expression turned thoughtful.
Excitement, yes, but also danger and...
He trailed off, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the scar on his jaw. Isabelle's heart clenched at the pain she saw flicker across his face. Without thinking, she placed her hand lightly on his arm.
And Carcassonne?
His eyes met hers, surprise and warmth mingling in their depths.
Carcassonne has possibilities I'd forgotten existed.
The weight of his gaze made Isabelle's breath catch. She withdrew her hand, suddenly aware of how forward she'd been.
Well,
She said, striving for lightness.
I hope you'll find those possibilities worth exploring.
I believe I already am, Raoul replied softly.
A comfortable silence fell between them as they approached a stall selling intricate wooden puzzles. Raoul picked one up, his calloused fingers surprisingly deft as he manipulated the pieces.
Remarkable craftsmanship, he murmured.
Isabelle watched him, fascinated by the contrast between his warrior's hands and the gentleness with which he handled the delicate puzzle.
You have a good eye.
She observed.
Do you enjoy such mental challenges?
Raoul's lips quirked into a self-deprecating smile.
I try, though I fear my skills lie more in the realm of the physical than the intellectual.
Nonsense!
Isabelle countered.
Solving puzzles on a battlefield requires just as much wit as solving them on a table. Perhaps more, given the stakes.
He looked at her with newfound respect.
You speak as if you know something of strategy, my lady.
Isabelle realized she'd let her disguise slip a bit, but found she didn't care. There was something about Raoul that made her want to be herself. Titles and expectations be damned.
Let's just say I have a fondness for games of logic,
She replied with a wink.
though I rarely find worthy opponents.
Is that a challenge?
Raoul's eyes sparkled with amusement and a hint of competitive spirit.
Perhaps,
Isabelle teased.
though I wouldn't want to damage your knightly pride.
Raoul laughed, a full, rich sound that sent a pleasant shiver down Isabelle's spine.
My lady, I assure you my pride can withstand a sound thrashing at the hands of a worthy opponent.
As they approached the edge of the marketplace, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the streets were filling with more people. Isabelle glanced up, suddenly aware of how much time had passed.
Ow!
She exclaimed, a note of panic in her voice.
I hadn't realized how late it's grown. I really must be going.
Raoul's face fell slightly, but he nodded in understanding.
Of course, I've kept you far too long with my prattling.
No, not at all.
Isabelle assured him quickly.
I've enjoyed every moment. It's just...
Duty calls?
Raoul finished for her, a knowing smile on his face. Isabelle nodded, relieved he understood.
something like that.
Raoul hesitated for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision.
Belle, before you go, I wonder if I might ask you something.
Isabelle's heart skipped a beat.
Yes?
I'm seeking employment, you see, as a knight in service to a noble house.
He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking boyish and uncertain.
I had planned to offer my sword to the House of Montfort. You wouldn't happen to know if they're in need of such service, would you?
Isabelle froze, her mind racing. Here was her chance to come clean about her identity, to tell him who she really was. But the thought of shattering this easy companionship, of seeing his eyes change when he realized she was Lady Isabelle, betrothed to another, she couldn't bear it. Not yet,
I believe they might be.
she said carefully.
In fact, I'm certain Lord Montfort would be interested in a knight of your caliber.
Raoul's face lit up.
Truly? That's wonderful news. And how would you know this, if I might ask?
Isabelle swallowed hard.
I'm a maid in the Montfort household.
She said, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue.
I overhear things, you see.
A maid?
Raoul repeated, and for a moment, Isabelle thought she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then he smiled, warm and genuine.
Well then, it seems fate has smiled upon me today. First, I meet a charming guide in the marketplace, and now I have an insider's knowledge of potential employment.
Isabelle forced a smile, guilt gnawing at her insides.
Indeed. You should go to the manor soon. Ask for an audience with Lord Montfort.
Raoul nodded, his excitement palpable.
I shall do so at once. Thank you, Belle, truly.
He took her hand, and, in a gesture that made Isabelle's heart flutter, pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles.
I hope our paths will cross again soon.
As do I.
Isabelle whispered, meaning it with all her heart. With a final smile and a bow, Raoul turned and strode away, his gait purposeful and full of renewed hope. Isabelle watched him go, her emotions a tumultuous mix of joy, guilt, and apprehension. As she made her way back to the manor by a circuitous route, Isabelle's mind whirled with the implications of what had just transpired. Chapter 4. Masquerade at the Manor. Raoul de Valbonne stood in Lord Henri de Montfort's study, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and an unexpected twist of anxiety. He had just been accepted into service, a moment he had been anticipating since his return to Carcassonne, and yet his mind was elsewhere, on a pair of intelligent eyes and a quick wit that had captivated him in the marketplace.
Welcome to our household, Sir Raoul.
Lord Henry said, his voice pulling Raoul back to the present.
I remember you as a promising young squire. I'm certain you'll serve us well.
Raoul bowed deeply, grateful that years of training allowed him to maintain his composure.
Thank you, my lord. I'm honoured to serve House Montfort once again.
As Lord Henry began outlining Raoul's duties, the door to the study creaked open. Raoul turned, and his breath caught in his throat. There she was, Lady Isabelle, the woman he'd known as Belle in the marketplace. She was dressed now in the finery of her station, but her eyes still sparkled with the same intelligence and humour he'd found so enchanting. Isabelle froze in the doorway, her eyes widening as she recognised Raoul. For a moment, panic flashed across her face, quickly replaced by a mask of polite interest.
Ah, Isabelle.
Lord Henry said, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room.
Come meet our newest knight, Sir Raoul de Valbonne. You may remember him from his time as a squire here.
Isabelle curtsied gracefully, her eyes never leaving Raoul's face.
Welcome, Sir Raoul. I'm afraid I don't recall our previous acquaintance, but I'm certain your service will be invaluable to our household.
Raoul bowed, a mischievous glint in his eye.
The honour is mine, Lady Isabelle. I'm sure we'll become well acquainted in no time.
Lord Henry nodded, satisfied.
Excellent. Isabelle, why don't you show Sir Raoul to the knight's quarters? I have some matters to attend to.
As they left the study, Isabelle's mind raced. How could she maintain her ruse as a maid now that Raoul had seen her true identity? To her surprise, as soon as they were out of earshot, Raoul leaned in and whispered,
So, shall I call you my lady or Belle when we're alone?
Isabelle stumbled, caught off guard by his playful tone. Raoul steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow, sending a shiver through her.
You knew.
She managed to sputter. Raoul's smile was warm and reassuring.
I may have been just a squire, but I could hardly forget the spirited young lady who once bested me in a game of chess. Though I must say, your skills in the marketplace were far more impressive than any chess strategy.
Isabelle felt her cheeks flush, a mixture of embarrassment and pleasure.
I'm so sorry for the deception. I just wanted a moment of freedom, to be myself without the weight of titles and expectations.
No apologies necessary.
Raoul said softly.
I understand the desire for freedom all too well.
They walked in companionable silence for a moment, both acutely aware of the other's presence. As they walked through the corridor, Isabelle noticed Raoul's eyes darting around, taking in every detail of the manor.
Comparing notes, Sir Raoul?
She asked, a hint of challenge in her voice.
I hope our humble abode meets with your approval after your grand adventures abroad.
Raoul's lips quirked into a smile.
I was just thinking how little has changed, though,
He added, his eyes twinkling.
I don't recall the tapestries being quite so faded. I fear, my lady, your household may be falling into disrepair without my vigilant service.
Isabelle raised an eyebrow, fighting back a grin.
Oh? And I suppose you fancy yourself an expert in household management now, Sir Knight? Perhaps we should reassign you to the laundry instead of the training yard.
I would be honoured.
Raoul replied with exaggerated solemnity, placing a hand over his heart.
I assure you, my skills with a washing paddle are unmatched. I once laundered an entire company's tunics in a single afternoon.
Isabelle couldn't help but laugh at the mental image.
Is there no end to your talents, Sir Raoul? Next, you'll be telling me you can outcook our kitchen staff.
Alas, my culinary skills are somewhat lacking.
Raoul admitted with a dramatic sigh.
I fear my attempts at cooking during the campaign were met with more groans than praise. I may have single-handedly driven the enemy away with the smell of my stews.
Their laughter echoed through the stone corridors, drawing curious glances from passing servants. Isabelle found herself reveling in the simple joy of their interaction, even as a nagging voice in the back of her mind reminded her of her betrothal to Baron Etienne. As they approached the knight's quarters, their steps slowed, neither wanting their time together to end.
Well, Sir Raoul,
Isabelle said, trying to inject some formality into her voice.
I trust you'll find your accommodations satisfactory.
Raoul nodded, his expression suddenly serious.
I'm sure I will, my lady. And I want you to know that I'll serve your family with all the dedication and loyalty I possess.
The sincerity in his voice touched Isabelle deeply.
I know you will.
She said softly.
I'm glad you've come back to us.
For a moment, they stood in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then, with a playful grin, Raoul broke the tension.
So, my lady,
He said,
when shall we have our rematch in chess? I've picked up a few new strategies in my travels. I might even stand a chance against your formidable skills.
Isabelle laughed, grateful for the return to their easy banter.
Bold words, Sir Raoul. We shall have to put them to the test. Soon.
With a final smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, Isabelle turned to leave. Raoul watched her retreating form, noting the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers twisted the fabric of her skirt. As she rounded the corner, she paused for just a moment, her head turning slightly as if to look back before disappearing from view. He stood there for a long moment, one hand resting on the door to his new quarters. The weight of his sword at his hip seemed heavier somehow, a physical reminder of the oath he'd just sworn. With a deep breath, Raoul pushed open the door and stepped inside, leaving the empty corridor behind. Chapter 5. The Weight of Duty. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the training yard as Isabelle watched from her chamber window. Below, Raoul moved with fluid grace, his sword flashing as he demonstrated techniques to a group of young squires. Even from a distance, she could see the reverence in the boy's eyes as they hung on his every word. Isabelle sighed, her breath fogging the glass. In the week since Raoul had joined their household, she'd found herself increasingly drawn to his presence, his wit, his kindness, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. All of it pulled at her in ways she'd never experienced before. A sharp rap at the door startled her from her reverie.
Enter,
She called, reluctantly turning from the window. Marie, her maid, bustled in, arms laden with fabric.
Begging your pardon, my lady, but the seamstress has sent the first designs for your wedding gown. She insists on beginning fittings immediately.
The word wedding hit Isabelle like a physical blow. For a blissful moment, she'd almost forgotten about her impending nuptials to the Baron. She swallowed hard, forcing a smile.
Of course, Marie. Let's see what horrors the good seamstress has conjured up this time.
As Marie laid out the designs, chattering excitedly about lace and pearls, Isabelle's mind wandered. She thought of the Baron, his cold, calculating eyes, his hands like grasping claws. A shudder ran through her.
My lady,
Marie's voice cut through her thoughts.
are you well? You've gone quite pale.
Isabelle shook her head, trying to clear it.
I'm fine, Marie. Just overwhelmed by all the preparations.
Marie's face softened with sympathy.
Of course, my lady. It's a lot to take in, but just think, soon you'll be Baroness de Sauveterre. Won't that be grand?
grand indeed.
Isabelle murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned back to the window, her eyes seeking out Raoul's figure in the yard below. He was laughing now, clapping a young squire on the shoulder after a particularly good manoeuvre. The contrast between Raoul's warmth and the Baron's coldness couldn't have been starker. For a wild moment, Isabelle imagined herself down there in the yard, sword in hand, learning from Raoul instead of being stuffed into yards of silk and lace.
My lady,
Marie's voice once again pulled her back to reality.
which design would you like to start with?
Isabelle turned, eyeing the sketches with thinly veiled distaste.
That one, I suppose.
She said, pointing at random.
Though I doubt the Baron will care what I wear, as long as I bring my dowry with me.
Marie gasped, scandalized.
My lady, You shouldn't speak so of your betrothed.
Isabelle bit her tongue, regretting her unguarded moment.
You're right, of course, Marie. Forgive me, I'm just nervous about the changes ahead.
As Marie began taking measurements, chattering about the latest gossip from the kitchen, Isabelle's mind drifted once more. She thought of her walk with Raoul the week before, how easy it had been to laugh with him, to be herself. The memory of his hand on her arm, steadying her, sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the morning sun. But then reality crashed back in. She was Lady Isabelle de Montefort, soon to be Baroness de Sauveterre. Her path was set, her duty clear. Whatever her growing feelings for Raoul might be, they were nothing more than a foolish fancy. Later that afternoon, Isabelle found herself in her father's study, poring over ledgers. Lord Henry looked up from his correspondence, a frown creasing his brow.
Isabelle, my dear, are the wedding preparations progressing to your satisfaction?
She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Her father's frown deepened.
You seem distracted of late. Is something troubling you?
For a moment, Isabelle considered confessing everything. Her dread of the marriage, her growing feelings for Raoul, her desire for a different life. But one look at her father's stern countenance quelled that impulse.
No, father.
She said, forcing a smile.
I'm just overwhelmed by all there is to do.
Lord Henry's expression softened slightly.
I understand, my dear. This union with the Baron is a great responsibility, but I know you'll rise to the occasion. Our alliance with House Sauveterre will secure our family's future for generations to come.
Isabelle nodded again, the weight of her duty settling over her like a shroud.
Of course, father. I won't let you down. As she left the study, Isabelle's steps felt leaden. She wandered aimlessly through the corridors, lost in thought, until the sound of laughter drew her attention. Peering into the great hall, she saw Raoul surrounded by a group of knights and squires, regaling them with some tale of his adventures. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Raoul's smile faltered, replaced by a look of concern. He made as if to move towards her, but Isabelle shook her head almost imperceptibly. With a final, longing glance, she turned and hurried away, her heart pounding. That night, as Isabelle lay sleepless in her bed, she stared at the canopy above her. The Baron's face loomed in her mind, his cold eyes judging her every move. Soon,
she whispered to herself, the word tasting bitter on her tongue.
Soon I'll be your Baroness, and all this will be just a distant memory.
But even as she tried to resign herself to her fate, another face kept intruding on her thoughts. Raoul's warm smile, his kind eyes, the way he looked at her as if she were the most fascinating person in the world. These images refused to be banished. Isabelle rolled over, burying her face in her pillow to muffle a frustrated groan. She was Lady Isabelle de Montefort, and she had a duty to fulfill. Whatever her heart might want, it didn't matter. She would marry the Baron, secure her family's future, and be the perfect, obedient wife. And if her dreams that night were filled with flashing swords, laughter in the marketplace, and a pair of warm, understanding eyes, well, that was no one's business but her own. Isabelle had just drifted off to sleep when a soft, urgent knocking roused her. Blinking in confusion, she sat up.
Who is it?
It's Marie, my lady, came a trembling voice. I need to speak with you, please.
Concern immediately flooded Isabelle. She rushed to the door, opening it to find Marie standing there, eyes red and swollen, her usually neat appearance in disarray.
Marie, what's happened? Come in, quickly.
Isabelle ushered her inside, lighting a candle and guiding Marie to sit on the edge of the bed. Marie burst into tears, her whole body shaking.
Oh, my lady, I've done something terrible. I've betrayed you.
Isabelle's brow furrowed in confusion.
Betrayed me? Marie, what are you talking about?
Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Marie confessed.
It's the Baron, my lady. I'm so ashamed.
As Marie's story tumbled out, how the Baron had charmed her with sweet words and wine, how one thing had led to another, Isabelle felt a cold knot forming in her stomach.
He was so attentive, my lady.
Marie hiccuped.
No man had ever paid me such mind before. But afterwards, he was so cold, as if I meant nothing.
Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks.
And now I've ruined everything. Your marriage, my position here. How can you ever forgive me?
Isabelle sat in stunned silence for a moment, trying to process everything she'd heard. Then, gently, she took Marie's hands in her own.
Marie, look at me. You've done nothing that needs my forgiveness.
Marie's tear-streaked face lifted, confusion and hope warring in her expression.
The Baron and I, our union is one of political convenience. Nothing more.
Isabelle continued, surprised by the steel in her own voice.
If anything, I should thank you for showing me his true nature before it was too late.
But my lady, surely you don't mean...
Isabelle stood, pacing the room as her mind raced.
The Baron clearly has no respect for the sanctity of our betrothal, nor, it seems, for the feelings of those he claims to care for.
She turned back to Marie, her expression softening.
You are not to blame for his actions, Marie. He took advantage of your trust and kindness.
Marie's sobs had quieted, but she still looked miserable.
What will happen now, my lady?
Isabelle sighed, sinking back onto the bed beside her maid.
I don't know, Marie, but I promise you this. You will not lose your position here. And as for the Baron...
Her eyes hardened.
Well, let's just say I'll be viewing our upcoming nuptials in a very different light.
As she comforted Marie, helping her back to her own quarters, and ensuring she would be all right, Isabelle's mind whirled with conflicting emotions. Anger at the Baron's callousness, sympathy for Marie's distress, and underneath it all, a growing sense of dread about her own future. When she finally returned to her bed, sleep eluded her entirely. The Baron's face floated before her mind's eye, but now instead of mere dislike, she felt a burning resentment. How dare he treat people so carelessly? How could she possibly bind herself to such a man for life? And unbidden, another face appeared in her thoughts. Raoul, with his kind eyes and gentle smile. Raoul, who treated every person, from the highest lord to the lowliest servant, with equal respect and warmth. Isabelle buried her face in her pillow, muffling a groan of frustration. Her duty to her family, her growing hatred for the Baron, her burgeoning feelings for Raoul, all of it swirled together in a tempest of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. As the first light of dawn began to creep through her window, Isabelle made a silent vow. She would find a way out of this betrothal. Duty be damned. She just had to figure out how. Chapter 6. Stolen Moments. The library of Chateau Montfort was Isabelle's sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in worlds of knowledge and imagination. But today, as she sat curled in her favourite window seat, the words on the page before her blurred into meaningless shapes. Her mind kept drifting back to Marie's tearful confession, to the Baron's callousness, to her own growing sense of desperation. She had always known her marriage would be one of duty, not love, but the reality of binding herself to such a man for life was becoming increasingly unbearable. Isabelle glanced at Marie, who sat quietly in the corner, busy with her needlework. The maid's presence was a constant reminder of the proprieties Isabelle must observe, even in her moments of private turmoil. A soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie.
Enter,
she called, hastily composing herself. The door creaked open, revealing Raoul. He hesitated on the threshold, looking uncharacteristically uncertain.
Forgive the intrusion, my lady. I was told I might find you here.
Isabelle's heart quickened at the sight of him.
Sir Raoul, please come in.
As he approached, Isabelle noticed he was carrying something, a wooden box, intricately carved. He settled into a chair across from her, the box balanced on his knees.
I hope I'm not disturbing your studies.
He said, gesturing to the forgotten book in her lap. Isabelle shook her head, managing a small smile.
Not at all. In truth, I welcome the distraction.
Raoul's brow furrowed with concern.
Is everything all right, my lady? You've seemed troubled these past few days.
For a moment, Isabelle considered brushing off his concern with a polite lie, but something in Raoul's earnest gaze made her hesitate.
It's nothing. Just wedding preparations. They can be rather overwhelming at times.
Raoul nodded, though his eyes suggested he didn't quite believe her.
I can only imagine. Though I must say, I've never seen a bride-to-be look quite so melancholy.
Isabelle felt her carefully constructed mask begin to crack.
Is it so obvious?
She whispered.
Only to those who care to look.
Raoul replied softly. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Isabelle felt as though Raoul could see right through her, to all the fears and doubts she'd been trying so hard to hide. It was terrifying, and oddly liberating. Clearing his throat, Raoul lifted the wooden box.
I brought something. I thought it might cheer you up.
Curiosity piqued. Isabelle leaned forward as Raoul opened the box, revealing a beautifully crafted chess set. The pieces were carved from pale wood and deep ebony, each one a miniature work of art.
Oh, Raoul.
Isabelle breathed, running her fingers over a delicate knight.
It's exquisite.
I remembered you enjoyed the game.
Raoul said, a hint of colour rising in his cheeks.
I thought perhaps. Well, if you'd like a rematch of our childhood contest.
Isabelle felt a genuine smile spread across her face for the first time in days.
I would love nothing more.
As they set up the board, their fingers brushed, sending a jolt of awareness through Isabelle. She glanced up to find Raoul watching her, his eyes warm with an emotion she dared not name. The game began, and soon Isabelle found herself lost in the familiar patterns of strategy and counter-strategy. Raoul proved to be a worthy opponent, his moves both clever and unpredictable. But it was the easy conversation that flowed between them that truly captivated her. As Raoul contemplated his next move, Isabelle's eyes fell on a worn book peeking out from his satchel.
Is that Boethius I spy?
Raoul glanced up, a grin spreading across his face.
Ah, you caught me. The consolation of philosophy has been my constant companion these past years.
A heavy red for a campaign, Isabelle mused, moving her knight.
Raoul chuckled, capturing one of her pawns.
True, but a comforting one. There's something reassuring about pondering life's great questions when surrounded by chaos.
He paused, his expression growing thoughtful.
There was this one night in Jerusalem.
Oh?
Isabelle leaned forward, intrigued.
We were camped outside the city walls, the eve before a major assault. The air was thick with tension. I couldn't sleep, so I pulled out Boethius.
Raoul's eyes took on a faraway look.
I read by moonlight the words about Fortune's wheel seeming especially poignant. And then I looked up and saw the dome of the Holy Sepulchre gleaming in the distance. It was breathtaking.
Isabelle's chest tightened at the wonder in his voice.
It sounds magical.
It was.
Raoul nodded.
But also bittersweet. So much beauty, yet so much conflict.
He shook himself, as if dispelling the memory.
But enough of my ramblings. Your move, my lady.
Isabelle studied the board, but her mind was elsewhere.
I've always longed to see such places,
she admitted softly.
To walk the streets of Athens, to stand where Plato once stood.
You would love it.
Raoul said, his voice warm.
The way the sunlight glints off the marble of the Parthenon. It's like nothing else in the world.
Their eyes met over the chessboard, a shared understanding passing between them.
Did you have a favorite place?
Isabelle asked, moving her bishop.
In all your travels?
Raoul considered for a moment.
There was this small village in the hills of Lebanon,
he said finally.
Nothing special to look at, but the people there.
He shook his head, smiling.
They had so little, yet they shared everything. I stayed there for a week, helping rebuild after a storm. By the end, it felt more like home than anywhere I'd been in years.
It sounds wonderful.
Isabelle sighed.
To make a real difference in people's lives like that.
You could,
Raoul said quietly.
You have a keen mind and a compassionate heart. I've seen how the people here look up to you.
Isabelle felt a blush creep up her cheeks.
You give me too much credit.
I don't think I give you enough.
Raoul countered, his gaze intense. A comfortable silence fell between them as they continued their game. Then, almost hesitantly, Raoul spoke again.
Do you remember that summer when we were children? The one with the great storm?
Isabelle's face lit up.
Oh yes, when lightning struck the old oak in the courtyard.
Raoul laughed.
And we were convinced it was an omen from God.
So we snuck out to investigate.
Isabelle continued, giggling at the memory.
Armed with wooden swords and far too much imagination.
Your father was furious when he found us.
Raoul reminisced, his eyes twinkling.
But impressed, I think.
Isabelle added.
At our bravery, if not our common sense.
They shared a laugh, the years melting away between them.
We were quite the pair, weren't we?
Raoul mused.
We still could be.
Isabelle said softly, almost to herself. Then, realizing what she'd said, she quickly added,
In solving mysteries of fallen trees, of course.
Raoul's expression softened.
Of course.
He echoed, though something in his tone suggested he'd caught her true meaning. As their game and conversation continued, Isabelle felt the weight on her heart grow a little lighter with each shared memory, each burst of laughter. For a few precious hours, she wasn't Lady Isabelle, bride-to-be of a man she despised. She was simply Isabelle, matching wits and sharing dreams with a man who saw her for who she truly was.
Check.
Raoul announced some time later, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Isabelle studied the board, a competitive spark igniting within her.
Not for long, Sir Knight.
As she contemplated her next move, Raoul spoke softly.
Isabelle, I hope you know that if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. Not as a knight in your father's service, but as a friend.
Isabelle's hand froze above her queen. She looked up, meeting Raoul's earnest gaze. In that moment, she wanted nothing more than to pour out everything. Her fears about the marriage, her growing hatred for the Baron, her desperate desire for a different life. But the words caught in her throat. She was Lady Isabelle de Montefort, and she had a duty to fulfill. No matter how much she might wish otherwise, she couldn't drag Raoul into her troubles.
Thank you, Raoul.
She said instead, forcing a smile.
That means more than you know.
Something flickered in Raoul's eyes. Disappointment, perhaps. But he merely nodded, turning his attention back to the game. As their game and conversation continued, Isabelle felt the weight on her heart grow a little lighter with each shared memory, each burst of laughter. For a few precious hours, she wasn't Lady Isabelle, bride-to-be of a man she despised. She was simply Isabelle, matching wits and sharing dreams with a man who saw her for who she truly was. It was during their third match that it happened. Isabelle had just captured Raoul's bishop, a triumphant grin on her face, when a lock of hair fell across her eyes. Without thinking, Raoul reached out, gently tucking the errant strand behind her ear. Time seemed to stop. Isabelle's breath caught in her throat as Raoul's hand lingered, his fingers just barely grazing her cheek. Their eyes met, and the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. For one wild, breathless moment, Isabelle thought Raoul might kiss her. Part of her, a larger part than she cared to admit, hoped he would. But then reality came crashing back. Raoul pulled his hand away as if burned, his face flushing.
Forgive me, my lady, I forgot myself.
Isabelle shook her head, unable to form words. Her skin tingled where he had touched her, and her heart raced with a mixture of exhilaration and despair. The spell broken, they finished the game in awkward silence. As Raoul packed up the chess set, his movements jerky and uncertain, Isabelle battled with herself. Every fibre of her being wanted to reach out, to tell him how she felt, to damn the consequences and follow her heart. But the weight of her duty, of her family's expectations, held her back. She was betrothed to another, and Raoul was sworn to serve her house. There could be no future for them, no matter how much she might wish otherwise.
Thank you for the game, Sir Raoul.
She said formally as he rose to leave.
It was most enjoyable.
Raoul bowed stiffly, his face a mask of careful neutrality.
The pleasure was mine, my lady. I hope we can play again sometime.
As the door closed behind him, Isabelle sank back into her chair, her composure finally crumbling. She pressed her fingers to her cheek, to the spot where Raoul had touched her, and allowed herself one moment of pure, aching longing. Then, with a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and picked up her discarded book. She was Lady Isabelle de Montefort, and she had a duty to fulfill, no matter how much it might break her heart. Chapter 7. Echoes of the Heart. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Isabelle slipped out of the chateau, a worn cloak disguising her fine clothes. Her feet carried her swiftly through the waking streets of Carcassonne, retracing a path she'd taken weeks ago. The marketplace was just coming to life, vendors setting up their stalls for the day. Isabelle's eyes darted from face to face, her heart quickening with each passing moment. She told herself she was merely seeking fresh air, a moment of freedom before the day's duties began. But the truth whispered in the back of her mind, as insistent as the memory of gentle fingers tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. She paused at a familiar stall, her fingers trailing over leather-bound volumes. The bookseller glanced up, recognition flickering in his eyes.
Back again, mademoiselle?
He asked, a knowing smile playing at his lips.
Or should I say my lady?
Isabelle froze, her carefully constructed facade crumbling.
I don't know what you mean, she stammered.
The old man's eyes twinkled.
These eyes may be failing, but they're not blind yet. You've the look of nobility about you even in that cloak. No need to fret.
He added, seeing her panicked expression.
Your secret's safe with me. Now what can I interest you in today? Perhaps a tale of star-crossed lovers?
Isabelle felt heat rise to her cheeks.
No, thank you. I was just...
Looking for something?
The bookseller supplied, his gaze kind.
Or someone, perhaps?
Before Isabelle could respond, a commotion erupted nearby. A group of children darted through the crowd, laughing and shouting. One of them bumped into Isabelle, nearly knocking her off balance. Strong hands steadied her, a familiar voice cutting through the chaos.
Whoa there, young ones. Mind where you're going.
Isabelle's heart leapt into her throat as she turned to find Raoul beside her, his hands still on her arms. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the bustling marketplace faded away.
Belle.
Raoul corrected himself, glancing around.
I didn't expect to see you here.
Isabelle swallowed hard, acutely aware of his proximity.
I needed some fresh air. And you, Sir Raoul? What brings you to the market so early?
Raoul's hands fell away, and Isabelle immediately missed their warmth.
Patrol duty,
He explained, gesturing to his sword.
though I must admit, I find myself wandering this way more often than strictly necessary.
A loaded silence fell between them, filled with unspoken words and half-formed hopes. The bookseller cleared his throat, startling them both.
Perhaps the lady would like to see our newest arrivals. We've just received a fascinating treatise on the medicinal properties of herbs.
Grateful for the distraction, Isabelle turned to examine the book. But as the bookseller expounded on its virtues, her mind wandered. She could feel Raoul's presence behind her, solid and reassuring. It reminded her of that day weeks ago, when they'd first met in this very spot. She'd felt so free then, unburdened by her title and the weight of her impending marriage. For a few precious hours, she'd simply been Belle, a woman enjoying the company of a kind and intriguing man. Now, with the memory of their chess game still fresh in her mind, that freedom seemed further away than ever. And yet, Isabelle's fingers tightened on the book's leather binding. She thought of Marie's tear-stained face, of the Baron's cold eyes, of her father's unyielding expectations. But she also thought of Raoul's warm laugh, of the way he looked at her as if she were the most fascinating person in the world.
I'll take it,
She said suddenly, cutting off the bookseller mid-sentence. Both men looked at her in surprise.
the book.
Isabelle clarified, lifting her chin.
On herbs, I'll take it.
As she paid for her purchase, Isabelle felt a small thrill of defiance. It wasn't much, a book on a subject she had no real interest in, but it was a choice, her choice. Raoul fell into step beside her as she left the stall, his presence both comforting and unsettling.
An interesting selection,
He commented.
I didn't know you had an interest in herbal medicine.
Isabelle clutched the book to her chest like a shield.
There's a lot you don't know about me, Sir Raoul.
He raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile playing at his lips.
Indeed? Well, I look forward to learning, if you're willing to teach.
Their eyes met again, and Isabelle felt her resolve wavering. It would be so easy to fall into easy conversation, to lose herself in his company once more. But the weight of her responsibilities pressed down on her, as heavy as the book in her arms.
I should go.
She said, taking a step back.
Marie will be wondering where I've gone.
Disappointment flickered across Raoul's face, quickly masked.
Of course. Allow me to escort you back to the chateau.
Isabelle shook her head, perhaps too quickly.
No, thank you. I need some time alone.
Raoul bowed slightly, his expression unreadable.
As you wish, my lady. Until next time.
As Isabelle clutched her newly purchased book, ready to make her escape, a cold voice cut through the market's bustle like a knife.
Well, well, what have we here?
Isabelle's blood ran cold as she turned to see Baron Etienne de Sauveterre approaching, his lips curled in a mirthless smile. He was impeccably dressed in rich fabrics, a stark contrast to the simple folk around him. In one hand, he gripped a polished cane topped with a golden snake's head. In the other, he held the leash of a snarling, overfed hound.
My dear Isabelle.
The Baron purred, his eyes glittering with malice.
I had no idea you enjoyed slumming it with the commoners.
Raoul tensed beside her, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. The Baron's eyes flicked to him, narrowing with disdain.
And who is this gentleman?
He asked, the last word dripping with sarcasm. Before Isabelle could respond, Raoul bowed stiffly.
Sir Raoul de Valbonne, my lord. Knight in service to House Montfort.
Ah, yes.
The Baron drawled, tapping his cane against his polished boot.
I recall hearing something about a new acquisition. Tell me, Sir Raoul, is it customary for Montfort knights to escort noble ladies through filthy marketplaces?
Raoul's jaw clenched, but his voice remained steady.
I was on patrol, my lord, and happened upon Lady Isabelle. I thought it prudent to ensure her safety.
The Baron laughed, a harsh grating sound.
How gallant. Well, your services are no longer required. Run along now, little knight. I'm sure there are stables that need mucking out.
Isabelle felt a surge of anger at the Baron's dismissive tone.
Sir Raoul was simply...
Silence.
The Baron snapped, his facade of politeness slipping for a moment. He grabbed Isabelle's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh.
Come, my dear. This is no place for a lady of your standing. What would your father say if he knew you were gadding about with servants?
Isabelle tried to pull away, but the Baron's grip was like iron. She looked to Raoul, seeing the conflict raging in his eyes, the desire to intervene warring with his duty as a knight.
It's all right, Sir Raoul.
She managed, her voice barely above a whisper.
I'll be fine.
Raoul hesitated, then bowed deeply.
As you wish, my lady.
His eyes met hers one last time, filled with concern and something deeper that made Isabelle's heart ache. As the Baron led her away, his hound growling at anyone who dared come too close, Isabelle risked a glance back. Raoul stood where she'd left him, his fists clenched at his sides, a storm of emotions playing across his face.
I must say, my dear.
The Baron's oily voice pulled her attention back.
I'm disappointed. A lady of your breeding should know better than to associate with such rabble.
Isabelle bit her tongue, tasting blood. She clutched her book tighter, the small act of defiance giving her strength.
I was simply purchasing a book on herbal medicine, my lord. I thought it might be useful to know.
The Baron snatched the book from her hands, flipping through it with a sneer.
Useless drivel. Once we're married, you'll have no need for such nonsense. Your duties will lie elsewhere.
As they reached the Baron's opulent carriage, Isabelle felt a wave of despair wash over her. The freedom she'd tasted in the marketplace, seemed a distant dream now, slipping away with each step. The Baron helped her into the carriage with exaggerated gallantry, his touch making her skin crawl. As they set off towards the chateau, Isabelle stared out the window, her mind racing. The Baron, seemingly oblivious to her distress, began to expound on his vision of their future life together.
Now, my dear,
He began, his voice dripping with condescension.
once we're married, there will be some changes, of course. Can't have my wife gallivanting about in marketplaces like a common fishwife.
Isabelle bit her tongue, her fingers clenching in the folds of her dress.
Your primary duty
The Baron continued, tapping his cane for emphasis.
will be to provide me with heirs. Strong sons to carry on the Sauveterre name. I expect you'll apply yourself diligently to this task.
He paused, eyeing her with a gaze that made Isabelle's skin crawl. She forced herself to meet his eyes, fighting to keep her expression neutral.
Beyond that,
He went on, seemingly pleased with her silence.
you'll oversee the household staff, of course. I run a tight ship, and I expect nothing less than perfection. Any servant who fails to meet my standards will be immediately dismissed. I trust you'll have no qualms about enforcing discipline.
Isabelle thought of Marie, of the other servants who had been like family to her.
I'm sure that won't be necessary, my lord. Our staff is quite competent.
The Baron waved a dismissive hand.
We'll see. Now, as for your intellectual pursuits,
He glanced disdainfully at the herbal book he'd confiscated.
while I admire your desire for self-improvement, such activities must not interfere with your primary duties. I suggest you focus your energies on more appropriate pastimes. Embroidery, perhaps, or flower arranging.
But surely,
Isabelle ventured, unable to stay silent any longer.
a well-read wife could be an asset. To converse with your guests, to assist with correspondence.
My dear,
The Baron cut her off, his tone sharp.
I have no need for a blue-stocking wife. Your pretty face and noble lineage are quite sufficient. Leave the thinking to those better equipped for it.
He leaned back, a self-satisfied smile on his face.
Oh, and we must discuss your wardrobe. I have certain expectations about how my wife should present herself. I've taken the liberty of engaging a dressmaker in Paris. You'll be fitted for a new trousseau as soon as we return from our wedding tour.
As the Baron droned on about fashion, social obligations, and his plans to redecorate the Sauveterre chateau, Isabelle felt a wave of despair wash over her. The freedom she'd tasted in the marketplace seemed a distant dream now, slipping away with each of the Baron's pronouncements. Her thoughts drifted to Raoul, to the concern in his eyes, the warmth of his presence. For the first time, Isabelle allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she chose her own path, her own happiness. It was a dangerous thought, but as the Baron continued his monologue about her future duties as his wife, Isabelle held it close, like a flickering flame in the darkness. Back in her chambers, Isabelle sat at her writing desk, the herbal book open before her. But her quill remained untouched, her mind far from the properties of chamomile and lavender. Instead, she found herself sketching a familiar face, strong jaw, kind eyes, a scar that spoke of battles fought and won. With each line, each shadow, Isabelle felt the conflict within her grow. How could she reconcile her duty to her family with the longing in her heart? How could she bind herself to a man she despised when another occupied her thoughts so completely? A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Hastily, she covered the sketch with a blank sheet of paper.
Come in.
She called, composing herself. Marie entered, a bundle of fabric in her arms.
The seamstress has sent another design for your wedding gown, my lady.
Isabelle's stomach twisted at the word wedding. She stared at the delicate lace and shimmering silk, feeling as though the fabric might suffocate her.
My lady.
Marie's voice was tentative.
Is everything all right?
Isabelle looked up, meeting her maid's concerned gaze. For a moment, she considered confessing everything. Her growing feelings for Raoul, her dread of the upcoming marriage, her desperate desire for a different life. but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she forced a smile.
Yes, Marie. Everything's fine. Let's see what horrors the seamstress has conjured up this time, shall we?
As she examined the gown, making non-committal sounds at Marie's excited chatter, Isabelle's mind raced. She couldn't go on like this, caught between duty and desire. Something had to change. Her eyes fell on the herbal book, still open on her desk. A crazy idea began to form in her mind, a way to take control, to carve out a small piece of freedom for herself. It was reckless, possibly even dangerous. But as Isabelle fingered the delicate lace of her wedding gown, feeling its weight like chains around her, she knew she had to try. After all, what did she have to lose?